So, good afternoon, everybody. We're a little bit thin on the ground, but I expect people will start drifting in under pressure from the organisers, if for no other reason. Welcome to this panel, which is on blended finance for renewable infrastructure projects. How do we blend finance to enable these projects to be financed cheaply and quickly? Is really what we're trying to discuss this afternoon. I'm Helen Tarnoy. I'm the Managing Director of Aldrich International. We're a classic IPP working throughout Sub-Saharan Africa. I'll introduce the panel briefly, and they can feel free to elaborate on the introduction if they wish, and we'll get straight into the session. We have an hour and 15 minutes. I'd like to allow for questions at the end. So we will try to keep it snappy, as there are a lot of us. So immediately to my left is Svetla Stoeva, who is the Senior Investment Officer at the European Investment Bank. And she'll tell you a little bit about what the EIB has to offer in the term of blended finance. Next to her is Jasandra Naika, who is the CEO of Biotherm Energy. I'm sure to a number of people in this room, she doesn't need any introduction. Next to that is Svetoslav Gatchev, who runs Delphos International, which is an advisory firm that has worked in Africa for as long as I have, at the very least, and that's quite a long time. After that, we have Lucy Chege, who is an investment, she's a general manager of infrastructure finance at the Development Bank of Southern Africa. And I'm sure a lot of people are aware the Development Bank of Southern Africa has had a big role to play in the renewable program that has had such success in that country. After that, we have Ragnar Geri, who is the Director of for Project Finance Energy Africa and Asia for DEG. And I shall be putting him on the spot to tell us, we've seen a lot of success in Asia, how can we replicate that in Africa? After that, we have Martin Kavanagh, everybody's favorite lawyer, who is extremely experienced in project finance law in Africa, and he'll be answering questions on that particular subject, and no doubt many others. And finally, Kofi Kluse, who has joined Alain Ebobisse at Africa 50, just I think in the last month.
Yes.
So this is a new venture for him, formerly at the World Bank. So we will see whether Africa 50 has the key to unlock the problems that we are all familiar with. Now, because it's after lunch, and I'm quite sure people are thinking about having a little doze, I thought I might do something slightly different for this panel. I hope it works. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you a story about a project that needs help. And then I'm going to ask our panel to explain what resources are available, how to access them, and how they can help this project. How many football fans have we in the room? Good, decent number. So here we go.
You mean soccer, not?
I mean soccer, sorry.
Just check.
Should have remembered I have an American on the panel. So now I want to introduce somebody new. He's called Don Quixote. He was born and raised in a small Spanish-speaking, landlocked West African country. And he now lives in Madrid, where he's had a huge success in real estate. So he's made a lot of money. The president of this West African country, which I've called El Monte, is a huge football fan, soccer fan. And so he has commissioned the Chinese to build him a massive, wonderful new soccer stadium, on the back of which he has been awarded the Africa Cup of Nations final in 2022. But there's a problem. Soccer stadiums, as we know, need power. This is going to be televised all over the world, and it would be a disaster if the country were embarrassed by the fact that the lights go out just as the game starts. So he has asked his advisor, Sancho, to find a solution. I would say the president is also a signatory to the to the Paris Accord, and is very keen on renewable energy. This is a landlocked country. The current generating capacity is old, and it's all fueled with diesel, which has to be imported over 700 miles from the nearest port, with all the customs posts in between. So he doesn't want to have any more thermal energy. He wants a renewable project. So Don, of course, is a philanthropist and an idealist. He wants to help, so he's agreed to seed fund this venture. He's teamed up with Sancho, and they've decided the answer is a 50-megawatt wind project that they are going to develop in time for the Africa Cup of Nations. They've ruled out a solar project because obviously the sun goes down just as the stadium lights come up. So they've decided on wind. The El Monte is called El Monte because it has a large mountain, which is most of its land area, and it's very windy around the mountain. Nobody's measured the wind, but they know it's very windy. So they're now 18 months into this project, and the Don is beginning to feel the pinch because it's costing an awful lot more than he thought it would. The real estate market has collapsed in Spain because of Spain's imminent withdrawal from the European Union. He had no idea that the feasibility study would cost so much, and the rates charged by the technical, environmental, and legal advisors, Pache Martin, are quite an eye-opener for him. At least he's had the PPA drafted by an El Montean lawyer, so he knows that's okay. It's a lot cheaper, but he does think maybe there are one or two things missing. So the financial model, however, is done by somebody in his company whom he trusts, and it's throwing out a tariff of between 12 and 13 cents per kilowatt hour. So he's taken this to the regulator of El Monte and asked for approval, and the regulator has said, oh, no, there's no way we're approving that. We know it's 6 to 7 cents in Zambia, and that's all you're getting. So the president, meanwhile, is worried about the delay. He's losing his sense of humor, and Don and Sancho need help. So I want my panel to explain how they're going to help Don and Sancho in this really rather dire situation. So, Slav, I'll start with you. They decided that they could get advice from the World Bank. So they went off to Washington to consult the World Bank, and the World Bank said, well, you need to talk to Delphos. They're advisors, they're experienced in this, they'll point you in the right direction. So as it happened, they ran into Slav in a bar in Washington. And
where I'm normally to be found.
So, Slav, what advice would you give these poor developers who are running out of money, don't know what they're doing, and yet have their hearts are in the right place, they need to do this project?
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right that I think a lot of people in the audience would agree with you that pursuing projects in Africa is a rather chaotic affair. So, you know, your choice of metaphors is perhaps appropriate. Ultimately, Don Quixote was unsuccessful at charging at the windmills, but I guess he found moral value in trying something impossible. So for him, it wasn't the art of the possible, it was the sort of the moral dream of the impossible. But the audience here is probably after their bonuses and salaries and staying employed. So I'm sure that they're more, you know, they ultimately don't want to be engaging in purely moral, quixotic affairs. So what could be done in your vignette, in your situation, which is rather problematic from a number of perspectives, and how can we relate that to blended finance? So the good news here is that you know, the topic of blended finance implies what does it even mean when we say blended finance? It means that we're blending something with something else, and since I was at a bar, you know, perhaps I would give the example of a cocktail, right? Where, you know, what's the favorite American cocktail is a Manhattan, and what's in a Manhattan? It's bourbon and red vermouth, essentially. And so, you know, the bourbon is strong and you know, potent, and the red vermouth gives the balance and the sweetness. And so, just like in blended finance, you know, you have the regular loan, you know, that's your bourbon, you know, it's the regular loan that can come from IFC or OPEC or whomever, and that carries largely commercial terms, call it LIBOR plus 5%. And then, you need something to sweeten the deal, right? Because at LIBOR plus 5% or 7% or whatever the case may be, the deal may not be doable at the rate, at the feed-in tariff that Del Monte has in mind. And so then you need that sweetness to sweeten the deal. And that could be, a subsidized tranche from someone. And so blended finance, in a nutshell, is subsidized finance, okay? And so sort of just to define it. But before you can even approach potentially a blended finance purveyor or dispensary, such as IFC, which can give you, the sweet and the sour in one package theoretically, you have to have a bankable project. And so the way I would begin approaching the situation with them is I would say you need a bankable feasibility study. Now that's the other good news with blended finance is that it provides either grant or grant-like type resources for early project preparation studies. That's where they need to begin. They need an assessment of the wind resource. Hopefully on that tall mountain of theirs, there was a mast, during that period of time while people were chasing the PPA. And that little mast was spinning and collecting data. Now someone like DNVGL or someone, they're an exhibitor, so I'm giving them a shout out. So DNVGL or someone like that would need to then crunch the data and turn this into a financial model and analyze it and study it, et cetera. And so what I would say is I would take them from that downtown bar and I would put them in an Uber. Sadly, Uber has left Copenhagen. What's up with that? But I would put them in a Uber in DC, and we would cross the river and go to USTDA, and we would say, give us a feasibility study grant of, let's say, $1 million, so that we can prepare a bankable feasibility study.
That's
Cheers.
Great. Okay, so now they have their bankable feasibility study. Gisandra, you have a lot of experience of developing renewable projects in places where perhaps the fundamentals are not ideal. The utility in El Monte, which is called Montelec, it doesn't pay its bills. It hasn't invested in infrastructure. It's got quite a few problems, and yet the utility is going to be the customer of this wind farm. So, Gisandra, what problems have you encountered in raising finance for projects in these rather difficult situations? What do you think would help Don and Sancho?
Thank you for that. Well, I think first and foremost, besides the bankable feasibility study, we need to explain exactly what that would entail here. Given that it's landlocked and it's going to be a wind project, I would say logistics is going to be a key issue, the entire transportation side of it, but understanding it from an environmental perspective as well. Because before you even go out to secure funding and speak to your lenders, for me, it would be, do I have all the pieces of the puzzle in place, and are they actually in the right place before going out? Because with lenders comes due diligence, and with that comes extra cost, and given that the real estate market is sinking in Spain, I think we'd want to manage costs very effectively from that perspective. In terms of the challenges that we have is 9 out of 10 times when we go in and look at someone else's project, we tend to find a lot of things that we know a lender is going to have an issue. So our approach is very much, let's look at it through a bankability lens. Now, we're not lenders. We have a happy relationship with them, I think. But at the same time, we know how delays could arise in terms of getting a project to financial close. So we would do our own checks and balances in terms of ensuring that. There are a ton of difficulties in terms of securing funding, and especially in landlocked countries such as this, where the utility is of poor quality. Now, often, to entice the project, we like to see two things. We'd like to see a bankable PPA, which may not be the case here. But more importantly, what is backing that bankable PPA? Is there a put-call option agreement in place? Is there a sovereign guarantee? And is there any other protection or comfort we can get that when I'm 10 years into operations, this utility can still pay me, but more importantly, can pay me on time.
Yeah.
And these are the challenges that come up first, initially flagged whenever we talk about these kind of projects. And given that this area, El Monte, considers to be quite exotic in its view, I think that we'd have to really evaluate a variety of aspects before we actually go in: environmental, land, transportation, the utility, the uptake of the local community, the impact that we're going to have on all of these activities before we go and present to a lender and say, please fund me. But while we focus on the lender side, I think it's also important to focus on the equity side when it comes to these kind of transactions, because as much as it matters to a lender, it also matters to a sponsor. And more importantly, for me as the sponsor, I want to know when I'm getting my dividend out and how quickly is my lender going to allow for that to happen.
Could I just pick up, Helen, on the bankability point that both Slav and Cassandra have made? I think people think that a grant can sometimes be a solve-all for a project like this, and in fact, inevitably, the most difficult, the most conservative of the inputs into the project and the financing is the one that will determine whether it goes ahead. So having the grant is terrific. It might help the equity position. It might help do some upfront work, but it doesn't solve the problem if you still can't get a bankable project across the line for your project finance lenders. So that's really is the key, is to make sure that the whole thing makes sense before you look at the blending of the financing in. And I think in many cases in Africa, and both of the speakers so far have touched on this, it's thinking about where you can best deploy those grant funds. So we mentioned logistics, we mentioned studies, if it was a different project, transmission line, everybody knows transmission line is always a problem in projects like this, and whether you can unlock some of the problems that would otherwise be bankability problems by spending money up front.
Thank you very much for that. I think it's a good point that Gisandra made, that of course blending finance is not just blending different types of debt or concessional finance, grants, etc., but also the equity is very important, and the equity has to be there in good time and in sufficient quantity. So Don probably has a bit of a problem there too. He's going to have to find a friend or two. Svetla, I'll come to you. The EIB has a number of different instruments that can fall under the umbrella of blended finance, mixing Slav's sweet with the sour. So can you tell people a little bit about how you think that the EIB could help Don and Sancho in this rather difficult situation?
Indeed, thank you. So indeed, for EIB, blending means the use of donor resources, such as in the form of grants, in the form of subsidies, technical assistance, risk capital in various forms of equity, in order to combine them with the more traditional EIB senior loan that we would typically provide in this type of project. Now, for EIB, the main source of donor funding has been and remains the EU blending facilities. So most recently through the EU Africa Infrastructure Trust Fund, which is now winding down, but has already been replaced by the AFIF, which is the Africa Infrastructure Facility. Now, we do provide blending both to public and private sector operations, but I have to say that our experience has primarily been on the public sector side, and mostly through the provision of technical assistance. So in this particular case, of course, we would provide funding on behalf of the EU for feasibility studies, for the wind measurements that would be required, for the environmental studies, for grid stability related studies and the like. So technical assistance is one major form of blending that we would provide, most probably via the public sector side. We also think that blending can be very usefully applied to improve affordability, so that speaks to your point on the tariff. Now, of course, our purpose here would be not to cater to the political ambitions of the person in question in terms of achieving a tariff that is more comparable to what was achieved elsewhere in Africa. but in terms of affordability for the population, in order to achieve the social outcomes that would be desirable for the country and its economic development. So the way we would achieve this would be, for example, by providing a concessional loan to the government, which it could then on lend to the project on concessional terms, or it could contribute as equity, so in the form of a mezzanine or an equity instrument with a capped return, the goal in both cases being to lower the cost of funding, which would then translate into a more affordable tariff, of course, for the population. With respect to private sector, we feel that blending should be applied very carefully and really seek to be transformative because, of course, we have to strike the right balance between getting a project across the finish line, a project that may be borderline in terms of its risk return, but which has very desirable outcomes in terms of economic development. So this on the one hand, and on the other hand, being very careful not to achieve excessive private sector returns or indeed crowd out other market participants. So in that respect, we're trying to develop more innovative instruments which could be applicable here. For example, we're looking at portfolio guarantees for renewable energy, where, as one example, we're working with a reinsurer to help scale up their support to investment insurance in the area of African renewables, where we would help them insure for risks such as offtake risks, sovereign risk, political risk, and so on.
So that's addressing the matter that Gisandra raised about the support that is needed for this utility in order to make it bankable.
Indeed, indeed. So there are really various ways that we could be of assistance here, both in terms of improving project quality through better project preparation, so studies, technical assistance, and the like, and also de-risking the project in terms of financial risk and improving affordability.
So I think we're beginning to see a theme emerging here, are we not, of how we can help Don and Sancho find the right resources to keep their tariff affordable and get their project done. Kofi, I'll come to you next, if I may.
Sure.
Africa 50 has taken a slightly different approach in that it has separated the development financing, the project development, and the equity activities that it's involved in. Can you explain a little bit more about how Africa 50 is designed to speed up the whole development process? As many people in this room know, some of these projects, particularly the large ones in Africa, can take up to 8 years from inception to financial close. And that is not only very tedious for the people involved, it's also extremely costly. And so the idea, as I understand it, behind Africa 50 is to try to accelerate that process so that projects can be turned over more quickly. Kofi.
Thank you, Helen. Africa 50 has been established about 1 year ago with the view, indeed, to speed up the process of project development, but also to increase the pipeline of bankable projects. And the question that arises is always, well, there are many initiatives out there, and what is it that Africa 50 brings that is different? I guess where Africa 50 is specific is its shareholding. Africa 50 is being bankrolled by African governments, mostly. We have 23 governments. We have the African Development Bank. We have a few central banks as well, and other African institutional investors. And the difference that it makes is that it provides us with, I would say, a direct or a closer access to public stakeholders. And as you mentioned, project development in Africa has taken a long time, and partly or mainly that was because the public stakeholders, government, ministries, regulators, typically take a lot of time deciding what they want to do, often move the goalposts as time passes, whereby you think you have done all the various steps that are needed to get your project to the finish line, and actually you haven't reached the finish line. So having both a commercially minded institution, I mean, we operate commercially. The idea is that we invest early stage like any other project developer, putting our money at risk and looking for commercial returns. So being commercially minded, but also having access to the governments, but also having governments having a stake in us being successful commercially, so which aligns, in a sense, both the project development implementation, but also the return piece, the financial piece that it's behind it. I think that helps bridge or creates an additional bridge to public stakeholders. And our view is that we are going to be able, at least for a certain segment of the projects, to do a little bit more or things a little bit differently than the way they have been done before.
Thank you very much. Lucy, that takes us straight to you. In the South African Renewables Programme, one of the characteristics that we noticed was the very, very strong support it had from the government of South Africa. There was a complete focus on making this work, and it was very well prepared to ensure that that happened. What are your next challenges in South Africa? What are you going to be doing next? And would you go to El Monte?
So, I mean, within South Africa, I think there has been a session in terms of the way forward for the country. But I wouldn't say that all the challenges are cleared. I think in terms, if I just bring it back to the issue of blended finance and the example of El Monte, the first thing that we need to look at really, and we look at carefully, is the issue of equity that Cassandra talked about. Because we found that in many of the projects, yes, there could be the technical studies, there could be everything in place, but the equity is not in place. And very often, it's the local players that don't have the equity in place. So we found that we've got a blended instrument whereby we look to take a higher risk position to ensure that that equity is in place. Now, what that does is that it ensures that there's a fully funded project and that we then close off the market failure elements that would be there. The other issue that is important, if I just go back to blended finance, is around enhancing the development outcomes. So you'll find there's a PPA in place, there's a government that wants certain things to be in place, but you need to then also work in order to ensure that the developmental outcomes are there. That may mean additional studies, and we do have project preparation funds to assist with that, to ensure that whatever studies needs to be done from an economic development perspective can be done. And that forms part of the bankability of the project. So there are still a number of challenges, I think, that are still in place, and we still look to move that forward.
Thank you.
Helen, I think sorry to interrupt, this point about sustainability and viability is really important. We all know from projects we've worked on that if a project's forced upon a government, or at some point they realise that it's not something that's going to long-term be politically acceptable, project is basically dead in the water. And it's unbelievably important to ensure that projects are structured not just financially, but all the way through in a way that they are defendable. They're defendable by the government that puts them in place. They're defendable by the next government that's elected a few years down the track, and ensuring that all of these projects are very difficult. We all know that, but there's some things that are easy to get right. Proper documentation, proper advice, and that type of thing. And the things we can get right help make projects more sort of long-term viable and sustainable, I think.
I think what we're hearing is that the advice is there. There are people out there who can provide the advice. They can provide project preparation facilities. There's also PPIF from the World Bank, the Africa Legal Support Facility. There are a lot of people who are willing to fund governments to ensure, and this may sound sometimes strange, that the independent power producer, the reputable independent power producer, wants the government to have good advice on their side, so that what ultimately comes out of this is a fair deal for all and something that is sustainable. Whereas if the government is led by the nose into something they really don't believe in or don't want to do, as Martin says, it won't happen. It will fall apart at some point.
As an example, if I'm on the private sector side and the government is not advised by another good law firm, I'd tell the client it'll cost me twice as much to do. I mean, literally, it's everything runs so much more smoothly when the government's properly advised, not just legal, but right across the board.
So sadly, Don's and Sancho's costs are going to go up because they've used a local law firm that did get Sancho out of a little spot of bother at one point. But it has never done a PPA before, and that PPA will not survive scrutiny. So, Ragnar, I'll come to you. You have experience of working both in Asia and in Africa. Now, those are gross generalities because Asia and Africa consist of many different countries with very different cultures, languages, whatever. Nevertheless, there are some common threads to developing projects in developing markets. And it would be interesting to hear what you have seen in Asia that you think would be translatable to speeding up the development of these badly needed projects in Africa.
Yeah, thank you very much, Helen. So, actually, Africa is a very diverse place, as you already mentioned. Asia is probably even a more diverse place. So it goes from really poor countries like Nepal up to countries like Singapore, who have one of the highest GDPs in the world today per capita. And what can we learn from them? So at least those who have done a successful job in renewable energy also, most of them really took more a long-term perspective. Yeah? So they are not approaching renewable energy like, well, we need grid parity from day one, but we need to give confidence to investors, and we have to pay for the first investors, for the pioneer investors, a kind of ice-breaking fee, and afterwards, when there's trust, we can reach on a market base much lower tariffs than probably possible by any blending, also in the broad range. And so what they have done, a lot of them also have kind of their own blending, but it was a kind of intelligent blending. Yeah? So coming from the old world, a lot of the countries had a kind of coal tariff or a kind of thermal tariff, and they realized that this is not enough for the beginning of renewable energy, and they put kind of green tariffs on top of this. At the beginning, quite high, and later on, they completely dropped it in a lot of countries. This kind of attracted a lot of investors. And the good thing about this is if you need to blend or to subsidize, it's good to do it really at the beginning of the value chain, because then you keep competition among the investors, the developers. And that's basically the strength of the private sector, that it's all the time trying to see how can I do things better, more efficient, how can I improve technologies, so really keeping this up to speed. It's not what we see sometimes already in Africa, where we subsidize single projects, which lead to a situation where others think, well, if it's not subsidized, I cannot do it anymore, or they wait until subsidized comes across the region. But it's a kind of saying, well, the people might not be able to pay a certain tariff now, so we top up the tariff, and as soon as investors are reliable, we take it back, and then we get into a competitive process. And this is also what you see on the development of the markets, that in the beginning, they most of them also started with a bilateral negotiated PPAs. Then most of them moved into more competitive biddings, like we also seen already in some places in Latin America. And now already some of the markets have reached the stage where they can work only or in a combined mix with a spot market. So that means electricity is nothing, let me say, special anymore that needs to be contracted for 15 years, but investors are happy really also to trust on on a market like with a fast-moving consumer good. Yeah, so that probably is then the gold standard of doing this way. But of course, this is nothing that happens overnight, but it really is about giving investors the right framework. And so in countries, in the large countries like China or like India, for example, today we have in any year, we have in a single country, we have more new IPPs at a much lower price than in entire Africa. So this is kind of what it can affect if you really set the private sector and the investors on the right trail.
I think you're raising some very interesting points there. We've seen in at least one country in Southern Africa quite recently that some developers had been working on renewable projects for some years. And then the government got wisdom and thought they would just leapfrog that step and they would put these projects out to tender after these poor developers, of whom I'm not one, I would hasten to add, had done a lot of work and spent a lot of money. And so having the sort of phased approach to liberalizing the market, as Martin is describing, is, I think, a very good lesson to be learned. You have to accept that the pioneer projects will be more expensive, but somebody has to do that groundwork to get the documents in the form in which they need to be bankable, get all the bells and whistles that you need to make a sustainable project. I don't think anybody would suggest that the utility or the regulator in El Monte should be putting out a call for international tender for this 50 megawatts of wind farm, because frankly he wouldn't know where to begin. So procuring it on a sole source basis, on open book negotiation with Don and Sancho, one would hope, would allow him to get that first 50 megawatts and to have that stability so that he can then develop the market as it progresses. I think that's a very good point to have been made. Martin, you're nodding vigorously.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, similar point to that you've made there. I mean, again, and I don't want to harp on about it, but doing the things that can be done well is extremely important. And you know, there are so many difficult elements with these deals, whether it's land, whether it's transmission line, whether it's, you know, the sustainability of the tariff, whether there's enough money in the system. Some things can be done well. The regulatory regime can be sorted out. The documentation. So you look at, you know, DEG's. Using as an example, DEG's programs for renewable power around Africa, or the IC scaling solar, which I think you were alluding to, Helen. I mean, one of the things that makes those schemes so strong is the standardization of the paperwork. And I know that sounds terribly boring, but it's extremely important to understand that there's going to be a reliable structure within which developers will come to the market. You mentioned Nepal. We've advised the Nepal government for the last 5 years on the hydropower program, which are very large cross-border hydropower. They started with nothing, with no previous example of international cross-border projects, and they were willing to invest, you know, a year to come up with documentation, and they've used the same documentation now on 5 very large cross-border hydropower projects. And that, of course, was funded. It was grant funded through DFID in the UK initially and other donors. But that's, for me, as an example of you address a very difficult, you know, the geology and the geography in Nepal is difficult. Selling power across border to India and to China is difficult. You know, at the time this happened, Nepal didn't have a government. It was still in a state of no government after the civil troubles. And yet they were able to put a structure around and run, you know, some bilateral projects, some other bidded ones, and they've attracted international developers. And it's a good example because the vast majority of countries in Africa are far more developed and have far better structures in place than Nepal did at the time that we went there. And in the period of 5 years, they've signed 3 project development agreements with international developers for very large projects. It's just an example of, I think, number one, good use of fund grants, but also the patience and the time to put a good structure around. So, and like I keep saying, to do the things that can be done, the easy things, to do them well. The other point, again, just is again conformity to the extent possible. So, you know, there's a lot of good products out there in the market. If you look at the loans that, you know, EIB use, IFC, DG, and so on, you can expect and you will see similar documentation when deals come around again. There's no reason why people should have to reinvent the wheel. Large amounts of this are very, very straightforward. You mentioned PPAs, having a bankable PPA, having an international law firm work with a local law firm to do that, and then to, in some countries, you know when you get a PPA what it's going to look like, and in other countries, you can get 10 over the course of 2 years, and there'll be no semblance between them of any commonality with other documents. And that, to me, is crazy, because you have all of the same problems every time. Everybody prices the risk for not knowing what's actually going to happen instead of taking that risk factor out. So,
Thank you. I'd like to come back to Sveta and maybe also Ragnar. One of the blended, as we've all agreed, blended finance can mean many things to many people, a little bit like public-private partnership. That can also mean many things to many people. But one of the things we have not seen a huge amount of recently is the, in your case, KfW working with DEG on the same project, or in EIB, the public sector, part of the bank, the private sector. Is there room to blend those sources of finance, perhaps by routing some of that funding through government? I'll come to you first, Sveta.
Yes. No, indeed, and I mean, well, I like to think that we do that quite a lot and quite well within the EIB, especially in the African context, where, for example, scaling solar was mentioned with the first projects that we see coming to financial close in Zambia, where EIB is very happy to be working with IFC in the actual financing stage. And indeed, we are looking at providing both a loan to the to one of the private sector sponsors that have won the bid, as well as to the government of Zambia, which is investing in the scaling solar project through IDC. So we're doing that. In this particular case, we're also doing it in various other geographies throughout Africa. For example, we're looking at a hydropower plant, which is in a very challenging market on the border between DRC and Rwanda. There, we're looking at financing both the public side and the private sector side, because indeed, I think there is a very important role to be played by DFIs, which can do both sides and can do so successfully to the benefit of the project. And in that particular case, we're also providing some blending finance through grants that will be used for technical assistance, geological studies, and the like. So it is a really excellent point that there is, I think, a very good role to be played by DFIs in supporting both the public sector, where we are quite uniquely positioned, versus perhaps commercial players, and of course the private sector to make the projects a success.
Yeah, probably the public sector, especially in countries where private electricity generation is new, is even more important, because a lot of the countries are only used to do it on the state budget, so they basically don't have to care much about other parties. And then suddenly the investors, private investors for IPPs appear on the scene, and they're asking for a lot of things. And you could ask yourself as a government, well, do I have to do all this, or are they pulling me over the table, or I don't trust them, whatever. And this is often a challenge that the knowledge is not there enough really to have a reasonable counterpart. And so therefore, especially also educating governments on what is good standards is very important part of the game. And if you don't do this, as Martin also mentioned, you end up having the double legal cost, and probably the government will still not feel well advised. And if you also put your shoes into the shoes of an investor, then you see that you're asking someone private who could basically invest anywhere in the world of probably, if you look at a hydro, pouring a lot of concrete there, depending on you as a government for paying for the next 20 years, basically with having no alternative, having securities you probably, or collaterals you will never get out of the country again, because there's fixed installations. So of course you want to have some more cushion, you want to have some more security, as if you are in a fast-moving consumer good business where they say, okay, I can change my strategy tomorrow and not sell this but that to a different client group. So I think this is still an understanding and a giving and taking that needs quite a lot of advice, and that's not in South Africa, but in a lot of other countries, it's probably the most important part.
Yes. Helen, sorry, just would like to intervene a bit. I do agree that uniformity or conformity of documentation, technical assistance for government to be able to negotiate on a level playing field with sponsors, etc. All these things are quite important and I think are necessary. However, I guess that the key remains the ability of getting the trust of the government, even when you have these things in place, because you may have a technical assistance, and we have seen that many times, where the government actually doesn't understand or doesn't relate to the assistance provided, and is unable, as you said, for example, to negotiate a tender or to be able to do things that have been done elsewhere many times over and are rather commoditized. So all the blended finance that might be available, all these things are great, but they're really not sufficient. And with these, and let's be honest, blended finance has been around in different forms before. With these, we have seen a lot of failures. So the question remains, what is the last mile needed above and beyond blended finance to get to the finish line in terms of project development, CapEx buy down, you can name it, output-based subsidies and all that is available. These things have to be leveraged and have to get finally to serve the purpose that was intended. And I'm not sure we're getting there, even if the number of the size of the pot available is increasing.
Slav, you've been doing this for a long time, and you've made good friends with Don and Sancho now over many Manhattans in many bars, and they've come to trust you and rely on you. You gave them advice about how to deal with the very early stage risk capital that's required for feasibility studies. How are you now taking them through the process as they are faced with all the available sources of blended and unblended financing? How are you guiding them to know what they need to get their project over the line?
Yeah, your question is really multifaceted, and I want to focus on one particular aspect of it, and that is the risk mitigation tools related to the PPA and the offtake arrangements. And so, let's assume that the utility of the hypothetical country is on the verge of bankruptcy, which most utilities in Africa are, if not quite bankrupt, then at least they don't have investment grade rating. Eskom used to, and NamPower still does, but those are the exceptions to the rule. And therefore, what do you do when you have a long-term PPA, which is properly structured and well drafted by Martin? If the PPA is with an entity that is teetering on the verge of bankruptcy and relies on continuing subsidies from the budget, no lender, not even DFI lenders, will agree to lend to such a project. So you need some sort of government backstopping of that PPA. So as a starting point, you would have to negotiate an appropriate level of government support of the PPA, be it through some sort of a government support agreement, government guarantee agreement of the utility, what people are doing these days, put and call option agreement, etc. And so then that's a necessary but not sufficient condition for at least the government to say that they're standing behind the utilities payment obligations under the PPA. Now, that solves problems in certain countries. So, I've been working for the government of Botswana for a number of years, and there the utility is borderline bankrupt, the Botswana Power Corporation, but the government itself has an investment grade rating. So if you could get, the government of Botswana to provide a government guarantee of BPC's obligations under the PPA, then you have a financeable structure, right? So there you're good. But our hypothetical country, safe to assume, is their debt rating is junk if they're even rated, and therefore having the government guarantee is another necessary but not sufficient condition. You need yet another layer of guarantees on top of that, and that's where we're bringing the discussion back to blended finance, where ideally blended finance will come in, as Svetla said. And by the way, Svetla is Bulgarian as well, and has a very similar name to mine. And so what are the odds that two Bulgarians will be on an Africa
They
Power
don't
panel?
look quite alike.
So, of a country of 8 million people, but great. Yeah, all the Bulgarians in the audience. Let's sing the national anthem. Yeah, globalization is great. Don't believe what Donald Trump tells you, and he's my president. Where was I? So you need to get someone to address the market failures, as Svetla rightfully said. Otherwise, you have potential distortions. And a market failure is the unavailability of government counter guarantee arrangements, right? So you have your PRI instruments from MIGA and OPEC and the like, but political risk insurance, while very valuable, also has severe limitations with respect to breach of contract cover, because effectively, even though on the tin it says breach of contract cover, in reality it is arbitration award enforcement cover. So you have to win an arbitral award against the offending government in the first place to be able to collect under a PRI policy, which makes the instrument really not as valuable as people imagine it is, because a government has the resources to pay fancy lawyers, right, to drag you through ICSID and et cetera, and stall the arbitration for years and years, whereas an SPV is not gonna, is gonna be bled dry. And so what could be a better instrument? Well, you could say, the World Bank, what used to be known as PRG, they rebranded the product, so now they call it payment guarantees as opposed to partial risk guarantees. A World Bank payment guarantee could be appropriate. And indeed, that is a more flexible instrument where if the government doesn't pay, you just serve a claim and you get theoretically paid immediately by the World Bank. The problem with those is that they require a government counter guarantee, which is very difficult to obtain. So then, from a simplistic perspective, wouldn't it be nice if there was an instrument that paid on demand if the government doesn't pay, but doesn't require a government counter guarantee? And the good news is that apparently the IDA and IFC are thinking about such instruments. But more innovation is needed in the area of PPA guarantees and government counter guarantees.
Yes, we are, of course, talking about a fictional situation. But yes, we should live in hope that additional instruments will be forthcoming. Some of you will have been in Accra last week when the World Bank announced the new private sector window, which is a concerted effort to pull together the private sector and the public sector in order to stimulate investment in these badly needed power projects. Gisandra, Slav mentioned something there that I'm sure you are familiar with. In our hypothetical situation in El Monte, it's very clear that the president is the one who wants this project. He is absolutely clear that if there is an egg on his face during the Africa Cup of Nations, it'll be a disaster. So he has to have this project. But will that message trickle down to the people who actually have to deliver the paperwork, they have to deliver all the material that needs to be put into this project at the civil service level, indeed at the ministry level? And how do you think that problem, if it is a problem, will be managed?
I have to first ask, is he going to be around after the next election?
Or after the next coup.
Oh, yes.
Absolutely.
I think that, we always talk about leadership coming from the top. And if it is his vision, then how does he actually go about implementing that? And I think from a large perspective, it really needs to be a push all the way down from his Minister of Energy. And it's not just the Minister of Energy. I remember in South Africa, we had 12 different government departments involved in order to get the round one projects to financial close. So making sure that everyone is on board to get it done. So I think for the people of El Monte, this is probably going to be a pride and joy, given that I'm sure soccer is one of their, or football is one of their favorite sports, and therefore, you know, who wants to watch soccer in the dark, let alone the players? So I do think there would be that push, but it's also the training and the know-how that is required in order to get this project, even at the technocrat level, to a certain point in terms of its approval. And what support does that government actually need, be it the regulator, so right of generation license, the grid if there's one, the utility company, the environmental authorization unit, because if it's a wind project, you know, birds, bats, bees all need to be taken into account, and really driving home. And that's what we really see 9 out of 10 times to be the weakness. The fact that there is no alignment in terms of getting it done, and clearly no sense of urgency in getting things done. And often this tends to go in waves. 18 months before an election, you know, there is no power. How can you be in power if there is no power? Comes out in every single political slogan. And really, we need to show there's that push, there's that understanding, the know-how. And to a large extent, it is not something that is provided. And I urge our DFI community, to a large extent, to consider providing training, providing information, hand-holding in that aspect of it, because I do believe that will accelerate not just a closing of a project, but the improved bankability of a project.
Thank you. I want to leave a little time for questions, but I'd like to go back to Lucy. Lucy, I asked you if you would go to El Monte, and you didn't reply. But to what extent do you think that the kind of blended finance package that you put together in South Africa for the Renewable program, do you think that is easily replicated elsewhere? And would DBSA itself do that outside the borders of South Africa?
Okay, thanks, Ellen. I thought I was off the hook for a moment there. So essentially, we are looking to replicate the renewable energy program outside South Africa. There are certain building blocks that need to be in place. I think one of them is the capacity support that everybody's spoken about. It's all well and good to have the good ideas, but you need to have that hand-holding, you need to have that capacity support. Secondly, then we look to our lawyers to look to the regulatory environment in each and every country, because each and every country is very different. And I mean, most importantly, we need to see that political will. So yes, the president is behind it, but it needs to be there needs to be that alignment across. So we may have the tools, but we need these pre-building blocks in order for the tools to then work. Yeah. So yes, we would go there.
That appears to be another theme that is running through. The building blocks have to be there and in place. We have about another 10 minutes, so if anybody has a burning desire to ask a question, I'm sure my panel will be more than happy to answer. Could I ask that you don't pronounce, that you don't grandstand? Can I ask that you really do make use of the presence of this very, very experienced panel to ask questions of them and to get information from them, both now and, of course, afterwards. And please speak clearly so that we can all hear you. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Kimberly Heimert. I'm with Sherman and Sterling, and until January was General Counsel at OPIC. My question is, well, first of all, I agree that blended finance is very important in some circumstances. Where I get concerned is when you've got one entity that is providing the combination, and where you do have DFIs in particular that are supposed to be going in providing non-concessional financing to crowd in private sector and private sector lenders, commercial banks, and creating a situation where the whole package of financing ends up being concessional, and whether there is potential for a race to the bottom. And I'm wondering what the DFIs are doing and thinking about and discussing with one another to prevent that race to the bottom of just providing concessional finance when you are, frankly, competing with one another.
Which of the DFIs wants to take that? Will you take that?
Yeah, I'm happy to take it up. So yes, the race to the bottom is actually a big concern to the whole energy sector, and we can only avoid it by using blended finance or concessionary finance in a very reasonable and thoughtful manner. Yeah, the one, as the panel also outlined today, is using it more for preparational or for technical assistance. The other one would be also mainly to still keep playing level field for all developers, and probably not supporting single projects, but more supporting the whole program or supporting the whole energy sector in a country. And of course, these days there is competition. There's also competition among DFIs, but I think especially at that point in time when commercial banks could also offer special financings, they should have a clear priority of doing so, because it's really not the task of DFIs of crowding out commercial players, but really to crowd them in and to provide that piece of the financing that is not available in the commercial space.
Do you want to add anything to this?
Well, I guess just to agree, I think the DFIs have, I mean, it's a natural thing that was going to happen. And I think as soon as we see it happening, I think it's identified, and people, you know, at the end of the day, as DFIs, our shareholders also keep us on a very, under very close scrutiny. And, well, at least in our case, actually, it's quite difficult, and we get really put through a very intense process when we ourselves, you know, apply for this EU financing, for example, in the case of the EU blended facilities, where we really have to justify the additionality, the crowding in, the, you know, all of these impacts are as they should be, and that, you know, we're not crowding out private sector, we're not leading to excessive private sector returns, and so on. And this is why we are now really moving to developing instruments such as what I mentioned in terms of indeed addressing the issue that Slav pointed to, which has to do with the offtake and the quality of the offtake, and addressing those types of risks. So I think that the point is very well taken, but at the same time, we are trying to address it as best we can. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks. Some over there. Can you speak clearly, please? We're having a bit of difficulty hearing on the panel. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I think I'll be loud enough. Yeah, in the story which you've given, I think there's three aspects of it. One, there's commitment at the top for a project to come up. Then there's bankability of the project. But we're talking about project preparation facility. If the project is not bankable, no matter how much project preparation facility you put in, it does not make it bankable. It has to be viable on its own. It only, maybe the project preparation facility will inform you that this project is not worth doing. Mm-hmm. I think it needs to be clear, because each time we talk of a project preparation facility, there's tendency for government to think even any dog can run, any project which is already dead can be made bankable because you put in money. You don't put good money to chase bad money. Yeah. So what we're asking the DFIs around probably is, instead of calling it blending, whatever, can they develop an instrument of a wrapper? If a project is viable, but the country risks and other risks are inherent, which are beyond the project, can we develop a project where a wrapper or a lead syndication where you're giving a guarantee to the project that in case this is country risk, not project risk, so that if any project which is viable can be financed despite a poor country risk? Because at the moment, good projects are being swallowed by poor country risk, instead of the other way around, that the world should look at all viable projects and see how to stop country and maladministration from affecting
Thank you.
progressive
Yeah.
projects.
Thank you very much.
A quick
Do you want
stab.
to answer that?
Yeah, I'm going to take a very quick stab at this. You're absolutely right that good financing doesn't make a bad project good. Okay, I mean, so we all agree, okay? And with respect to project preparation facilities, it is an absolute pain in the neck to get a grant out of them. And it's for a good reason, because they don't want to support, a priori bad projects. I mean, but there's a chicken and egg situation, because, as you said, unless you do a feasibility study, you don't know whether a project is viable or not. So someone has to take a very early bet to say, is this project worth, $1 million bet to pay for a bunch of consultants to do their work? And so, for example, when you go to the US TDA, the Trade and Development Agency, which is the US Power Africa instrumentality that gives feasibility study grants, you almost need a mini feasibility study to get the feasibility study funding out of them, okay? And that's something that the firm like ours helps with. So rest assured, it's not easy to get these things. In fact, it's very difficult. And we all talked about the guarantees and the fact that guarantees need to be there to provide this wrap so that good projects can indeed move forward.
Yeah.
It's just my
Kofi?
sense.
Yes, just wanted to add something to your last point and to comment on it. You said it would be good for good projects in a given country not to suffer from the country's standing or situation. Well, I beg to differ. I think it is very important that actually the country gets their house in order to attract private investment. Because you know what? Whatever the good financing, the good project intrinsically that might exist in that country, the situation of that country, the political risk will always come into play. And 10, 15 years down the road, you will have problems, and problems that you would have avoided not having financed a project in a country that was not sustainable politically. So better for the country to get the house in order, to attract financing sustainably, instead of trying to get around such a fundamental risk.
Anybody else? If not, I'm going to ask the panel one by one, starting just going on. Do you think that Don and Sancho, after all you've heard, all we've discussed, do you think they're going to be able to deliver this project on time for the 2025, sorry, did I say 2022, Africa Cup of Nations? Are they going to be able to get the financing and deliver the project?
Well, I think with all the quality advice that Slav will provide, the amazing drafting from Martin and so on, the equity and the DFI financing, no problem.
Wonderful. Gisandra?
I actually think Don and Sancho need to partner with a well-established developer like ourselves who can actually assist them in taking this project through to financial close and construction. And I do think it's possible by 2022 if we're talking about June 2017 start date.
I would actually agree with Gisandra wholeheartedly that good sponsors, well-capitalized sponsors, competent sponsors can weather the inevitable storms that will come about. The government hiccups, the macroeconomic hiccups. And so it's very important for original developers to work with experienced later stage developers and also with experienced private equity funds like Actis that can provide that additional firepower. I'm just looking at the forum sponsor, Agreco. Just in case, it may not hurt to have a bit of a thermal backup.
Of a backup, yeah.
Unlikely to be at the Zambian tariff, though.
Lucy?
I would agree. I think that to the extent that they've got good sponsors, then that should make it work. And with the good lawyers in town, it should work. But most importantly, the president is behind it, so they've got the political will, and that will help to drive it through the processes that it needs to go through.
Yes, we haven't discussed when he's up for election,
yes,
but
it will work.
we'll leave that one. Ragnar?
Yes, I agree fully. So if there is a learning curve also with the president, that it's not only important to work shortly before the next election on the reform of the energy sector, but really actively use the 4 years he has until 2022. I think that's enough time, not even to get this project on stream, but really to set up a proper program where a lot of sponsors, investors will be interested.
Martin?
I think on their own they'd have no chance. I think with a experienced developer and with support of DFIs and proper advice, they can definitely get there. They also need the ability to put some capital in pretty quickly to get things moving. If there's an inability to spend money until financial close, then I think the window closes.
Yes, so as an Africa 50, I would say, Director of Project Development, I would say, yes, they should come to me. But to be quite honest, I haven't seen lately any African Cup, World Cup, European Cup initiative to be a profitable one. So the question is whether El Monte really needs a white elephant. I don't know.
Good question.
Right. Well, I hope that's given you some information you didn't have before, some things to take away and think about. And I'd like you to give a big hand to our panel for this wonderful session. Thank you.